The scene was Paris, France, in September of 1943. In a tight, cramped workshop tucked into an attic on Rue de la Fontaine, a young woman named Marie Dubois, just 17 years old, was carefully placing a folded piece of silk, no bigger than a playing card, into the hollow cavity of a porcelain doll's torso. As she worked, her fingers shook just a bit, and you could actually see her breath hanging in the chilly autumn air as she sealed up the opening with glue. Down below on the streets, German patrol units were marching past, their heavy boots creating echoes against the cobblestone roads that had been witness to centuries upon centuries of history, though nothing quite compared to what was happening now. At this point in time, Marie genuinely believed she was merely assisting a handful of stranded airmen in finding their way back home, maybe a dozen men at the very most over the next few months. She had absolutely no clue that this seemingly harmless collection of handcrafted dolls she was creating would eventually transform into one of the most remarkably successful intelligence operations throughout the entire European conflict, ultimately saving hundreds upon hundreds of lives and completely baffling the occupying forces for nearly 2 full years. But before we get deeper into this incredible story, I want to ask you to go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And please tell me down in the comments section where in the world you're watching this from. It genuinely helps support what we do here. What you're about to hear is the extraordinary account of how one teenage girl's deep passion for making dolls, something her neighbors had dismissed as nothing more than a childish obsession, actually became an unbreakable code that military intelligence officers on both sides of the conflict would end up studying for decades afterward. This is truly a story about how the tiniest acts of courage, when multiplied across time, have the power to completely reshape the outcome of history itself. Marie had actually learned the intricate art of doll making from her grandmother, a woman named Elise Dubois, who was a master craftswoman in her own right and had supplied toy shops all across Paris before the occupation started back in 1940. The workshop itself had been passed down through their family for 3 full generations, and it was tucked away in the Latin Quarter, an area where artists and intellectuals had long established their homes and studios. When the German forces rolled into the city, most businesses either shut their doors permanently or were seized outright by the occupiers. But somehow the doll workshop seemed far too insignificant and unimportant to warrant any real attention from them. After all, what kind of threat could possibly come from an elderly woman and her teenage granddaughter who spent their days creating simple toys for children? The real truth, however, was far more intricate and complex than it appeared. Elise actually had connections to the French resistance movement through her late husband's network. When British and American airmen started getting shot down over occupied France in increasingly large numbers during 1942 and into 1943, the resistance faced an absolutely critical challenge that needed solving. How could they help these downed men evade capture without the occupying forces discovering and shutting down the escape routes they'd established? Paper maps were essentially impossible to conceal during the frequent and thorough inspections that were constantly being conducted. Anyone who was caught with military maps in their possession faced immediate detention and interrogation. What the resistance desperately needed was something so completely ordinary and commonplace that guards would simply wave it through checkpoints without giving it a second glance. That perfect solution arrived in the form of a man named Claude Beaumont, a former cartographer who had managed to escape from a labor camp and made his way back to Paris. Claude possessed a truly extraordinary skill that set him apart. He could reproduce detailed maps entirely from memory, with remarkable accuracy and precision. However, his maps needed to be extremely small, easily hidden away, and created from materials that wouldn't deteriorate or fall apart over time. Elise first met Claude through her resistance contacts in early January of 1943. Claude took the time to explain the serious problem they were facing. They had already lost 3 different couriers who were carrying paper maps, and those maps had been discovered during routine searches. Elise listened very carefully to everything he said, her weathered, work-worn hands folded quietly in her lap as she absorbed the information. Then, after a moment of consideration, she reached into her bag and withdrew something that made Claude pause in his tracks. A simple cloth doll, exactly the kind that children had been playing with for generations and generations. She turned the doll over in her hands to reveal a seam in the back that was nearly invisible to the casual observer. With her practiced, expert fingers, she opened up that seam to expose a hollow cavity hidden inside the doll's body. "We can use silk," she said simply and directly. "Maps can be printed on silk fabric. It doesn't make that rustling sound that paper does. It doesn't disintegrate or fall apart when it gets wet. And it can be folded down to something as small as a postage stamp." She paused for a moment, letting the full implications of what she was suggesting really settle in his mind. And honestly, who would ever suspect a grandmother of making dolls for children of doing something like this? Claude just stared at the doll she was holding, his mind absolutely racing through all the possibilities this presented. Silk could indeed hold detailed printing if they used the right techniques and methods. The British were already conducting experiments with silk maps for their pilots back in England, but those were being produced there and then smuggled into France with great difficulty and frequent failures along the way. But what if they could produce these maps right here in Paris, literally operating under the noses of the occupation forces? Within just 2 weeks' time, they had managed to assemble a small but dedicated team for this operation. Claude would take responsibility for creating the maps, reducing entire regions of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands down to miniature scale. A former textile printer named Henri Masson would handle transferring those maps onto silk squares that measured approximately 7 centimeters by 7 centimeters, and Marie would be responsible for incorporating these maps into her dolls, creating what appeared on the surface to be nothing more than an innocent collection of handmade toys. But Marie's role quickly expanded, well beyond just being a mere craftswoman in this operation. At 17 years old, she possessed certain qualities that made her uniquely and perfectly suited for this dangerous work they were undertaking. She looked even younger than her actual age, with a round, innocent face and wide eyes that made her seem completely harmless and naive to observers. German soldiers stationed at checkpoints would often smile at her and wave her through without conducting careful searches of her belongings. She deliberately played into this perception they had of her, dressing simply and modestly, carrying her dolls around in a worn canvas bag, and chattering nervously about how she was trying to sell them to help support her grandmother financially. It was a perfect cover that worked time and time again. The very first real test of their operation came in late February of 1943. A British pilot by the name of James Richardson had been shot down near the town of Amiens and had managed to make his way to Paris through a network of safe houses that had been established. He needed to reach the Spanish border, which was a journey spanning nearly 800 kilometers through occupied territory. The resistance could provide him with civilian clothes that would help him blend in, forged identity papers, and some money for the journey. But without a proper map, he would essentially be traveling completely blind, dependent entirely on guides who might or might not show up at the designated meeting points along the way. Marie arranged to meet Richardson in the basement of a pharmacy located on Rue Mouffetard. She remembered being immediately struck by just how exhausted and worn down he looked. His face was gaunt and hollow, and his hands were shaking slightly as he accepted the cup of weak coffee she offered to him. He couldn't have been any more than 22 or 23 years old at the most, though his eyes held the kind of weariness you'd expect to see in someone far, far older. She handed him what appeared to be nothing more than a simple rag doll, the exact kind that a child might drag around carelessly by one arm. The doll was wearing a faded blue dress and had yarn for hair, with its face painted on with a simple, sweet smile. Richardson looked at it with obvious confusion, clearly wondering in his mind if this was some kind of joke being played on him. Marie demonstrated how it worked, keeping her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke. She carefully opened the seam at the back of the doll's neck and withdrew the silk square from inside, unfolding it slowly to reveal an incredibly detailed map. The map showed the entire route from Paris all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains, with safe houses marked by tiny dots that could easily be mistaken for simple printing floors if someone didn't know what they were looking for. Major checkpoints along the route were indicated by almost invisible pinpricks in the fabric, and alternate routes were marked with threads so fine and delicate that it looked like it was just part of the fabric's natural weave pattern. Richardson's expression completely transformed from confusion to absolute wonder and amazement. He studied the map intently and carefully, memorizing all the key details before carefully refolding it and tucking it back into its hiding place, inside the doll. "This is brilliant," he whispered under his breath, clearly impressed. "This is absolutely brilliant work." He successfully made it all the way to Spain in 17 days total, traveling mostly during the nighttime hours and avoiding the major checkpoints by using those alternate routes that had been marked on the map. His official report to British intelligence, which was delivered after he reached Gibraltar, did mention the map but deliberately didn't reveal its source, as per the strict security protocols they followed. However, word gradually began to spread through the informal networks that connected the various resistance groups operating in the region. There was a new, reliable way to get maps to people who were evading capture, and this method had proven itself to be trustworthy. The demand for these map dolls grew rapidly and steadily. By April of 1943, Marie was producing approximately 3 dolls per week, with each one containing a completely different map depending on the specific needs of the person who would ultimately receive it. Some maps showed detailed routes to Spain, while others showed paths to Switzerland or to the coast, where small boats might attempt dangerous crossings to England. Each and every map was unique and customized, tailored to the specific circumstances and incorporating the latest intelligence they had about checkpoint locations and patrol patterns that were constantly shifting. The work itself was absolutely meticulous and exhausting in every way. Claude spent countless hours creating each individual map, working by candlelight in a different location each week to avoid establishing any kind of pattern that occupation authorities might notice. Henri printed the maps on silk that he salvaged from old scarves, curtains, and clothing that Elise's network collected through sympathetic neighbors throughout the city. They used a special ink mixture that Henri had personally developed, one that wouldn't run or smear if the silk happened to get wet, and wouldn't fluoresce under the ultraviolet lights that occupation authorities sometimes used to detect hidden documents. Marie's part in all of this required incredibly steady hands and truly infinite patience. Each doll had to be constructed in such a way that the hidden compartment was completely undetectable, even if someone squeezed the doll or examined it closely under scrutiny. She developed specific techniques for weighting the dolls correctly so they didn't feel hollow or suspicious, using scraps of fabric and sawdust to create the proper heft and give them the right feel. She constantly varied her designs, creating boy dolls and girl dolls, dolls dressed in different costumes, dolls of different sizes, ensuring that no pattern would emerge that might alert suspicious observers to what she was doing. The operation expanded in ways that none of them had initially anticipated or planned for. By the summer of 1943, they weren't just helping downed airmen anymore. The scope had grown significantly. Resistance fighters who needed to move between different regions began requesting the map dolls for their own operations. Jewish families who were being smuggled toward Switzerland asked for them to help navigate the dangerous journey. Even some members of the French underground government in exile, who were parachuting back into France for covert missions, carried Marie's dolls as backup navigation tools they could rely on. The close calls and near disasters were absolutely inevitable given what they were doing. In June of 1943, Marie was stopped at a checkpoint near the Gare de Lyon by a particularly thorough German soldier who decided he was going to search her bag of dolls completely. She watched with her heart absolutely hammering in her chest as he picked up each doll one by one and examined them carefully. One of the dolls in her bag at that moment contained a map showing safe houses in Lyon, marked with codes that would be easily recognizable to anyone who had training in reading intelligence documents. The soldier squeezed the doll firmly, turned it over in his hands multiple times, and even held it up to the light to examine it more closely. Marie forced herself to breathe normally and maintain the slightly vacant, innocent smile she had practiced over and over. She babbled on nervously about how she was taking the dolls to a toy shop in the Marais district, how her grandmother was sick and Marie had to handle all the deliveries now by herself, and how business was so terribly difficult during these times they were living through. The soldier finally handed the doll back to her. "These are very well made," he said in heavily accented French, his tone almost appreciative. "My daughter would really like one of these." He looked at Marie with something in his expression that might have actually been kindness. "How much do they cost?" Marie's mind raced frantically to figure out what to do. She absolutely couldn't sell him the doll with the map hidden inside, but refusing his request might arouse suspicion and cause problems. "These particular ones are already promised to the shop," she said quickly, thinking on her feet. "But I can make one specially for your daughter if you'd like. What color dress would she prefer?" They arranged for Marie to deliver a custom doll to the checkpoint the following week. She spent 3 completely sleepless nights crafting a special doll, one that genuinely was just a toy with nothing hidden inside, putting extra care and attention into all the details to make it perfect. When she delivered it to him, the soldier seemed genuinely pleased with it, paying her with French francs that she immediately donated to the resistance fund they maintained for supporting families of detained members. But that incident truly shook her to her core. They had been lucky this particular time, but luck was definitely not a strategy they could rely on going forward. Marie convinced Elise and Claude that they desperately needed to improve their security measures across the board. They began using carefully selected code words to communicate about deliveries, never speaking directly about maps or the people who were evading capture. Marie developed an entire system for marking her dolls so recipients would know which ones contained maps. Those containing maps had a specific number of stitches in the hem of their clothing, invisible to casual observers but immediately recognizable to trained recipients who knew what to look for. By autumn of 1943, the operation had successfully helped more than 80 people reach safety in various locations. The number seemed absolutely miraculous to Marie, who still sometimes couldn't quite believe that her childhood hobby had transformed into something so tremendously significant and important. She kept a hidden record, though not of names, which would be far too dangerous to maintain, but rather of small personal details she remembered. The British pilot who had cried openly when she handed him the doll, because it reminded him of his daughter back home in England. The Belgian resistance fighter who had kissed her hand and called her an angel sent from heaven. The Jewish mother who had clutched the doll tightly and whispered prayers in Hebrew as tears streamed down her face. The work took a serious toll on Marie physically and mentally. She lost a significant amount of weight, her face growing thin and drawn from the constant stress and irregular meals that were all they could manage. Paris during wartime was a city of severe shortages, where bread was strictly rationed and meat was a distant memory for most civilians trying to survive. The long hours spent working in the drafty attic workshop left her with a persistent cough that simply wouldn't go away, no matter what she tried. Her grandmother worried constantly about her health and well-being, but Marie absolutely refused to stop the work. She had seen too many faces and heard too many stories about what awaited those who were captured by the occupation forces. Each doll she completed represented genuine hope. It represented a life that might actually be saved. The operation's success unfortunately created its own set of dangers and complications. As more and more people successfully reached safety and told their stories to Allied intelligence, British and American intelligence officers began to piece together that something quite unusual was happening in Paris. Reports kept mentioning consistently accurate maps that were actually better than the ones being produced back in England and smuggled across the English Channel with great difficulty. Allied intelligence naturally wanted to know more about the source of these exceptional maps, not to shut the operation down, but to potentially replicate the technique in other locations across occupied Europe. This attention, however well-intentioned it might have been, created serious new risks for everyone involved. Increased radio traffic asking specific questions about the maps might be intercepted by German intelligence. Queries from newly arrived agents might reach the wrong ears if they weren't careful. The more successful the operation became, the greater the chance that occupation authorities would eventually notice the pattern of evaders successfully navigating French territory with unusual accuracy. In November of 1943, disaster nearly struck them directly. A courier carrying 3 of Marie's dolls was detained at a checkpoint in Lyon. The man, whose name was Antoine Roussel, had been working with the resistance for nearly a full year and had successfully completed dozens upon dozens of missions without incident. But this particular time, something about his demeanor, or perhaps his forged papers, aroused suspicion in the guards. He was taken to a holding facility for intensive questioning, and the dolls were immediately confiscated and sent to occupation headquarters for thorough examination. For 3 absolutely agonizing days, Marie and her small team waited anxiously to see if their entire operation had been exposed and compromised. They prepared emergency plans for the worst-case scenario. Claude would flee immediately to the countryside. Henri would destroy all his printing equipment completely, and Marie and Elise would claim they were simply innocent toy makers who had absolutely no knowledge of what was being hidden in some of their products by others. Then word finally came back through the resistance network, and it was almost unbelievable. The examination had found absolutely nothing incriminating. The German intelligence officers had actually cut open the dolls completely, destroying them in their search, but they hadn't thought to look for the nearly invisible seams that Marie had crafted with such meticulous care and skill. They had found the hollow spaces inside and the wadding material, but not the silk maps themselves, which were folded so incredibly small and flat that they looked like they were just part of the doll's internal structure and construction. The examiners ultimately concluded that the dolls were simply poorly made toys with shoddy construction that left gaps in the stuffing. Nothing more suspicious than that. Antoine Roussel was eventually released after 2 full weeks of detention, having endured serious questioning but having revealed absolutely nothing to his interrogators. When he finally returned to Paris, looking thin and bruised but miraculously alive, his very first request was for Marie to teach him exactly how she made the dolls so perfectly undetectable to trained examiners. She spent an entire afternoon showing him all her techniques in detail, carefully explaining how she had learned to think like an examiner would think, to anticipate exactly what someone would look for and ensure it absolutely wasn't there to be found. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was recorded as the coldest winter in decades across Europe. Paris froze solid under heavy snow and ice, and fuel was so scarce and precious that Marie and Elise often worked while wearing gloves with the fingertips cut off, their breath constantly misting in the frigid attic air. But despite the brutal conditions, the work continued without interruption. If anything, the harsh winter made the maps even more crucial than before, as the terrible conditions made navigation significantly more difficult and dangerous for those trying to evade capture in the countryside. Marie developed several new techniques during this particularly challenging period. She began creating dolls with multiple hidden compartments, which allowed a single doll to carry not just a map, but also forged documents, currency, or tiny coded messages, all in one package. She experimented extensively with different materials, eventually discovering that certain specific types of cotton batting could be formed into shapes that perfectly disguised the silk packages hidden inside. She even developed an innovative technique for making the maps water-resistant by treating the silk with a special wax compound that Henri formulated specifically for this purpose. By spring of 1944, as Allied forces were actively preparing for what would eventually become the massive D-Day landings in Normandy, the map doll operation had evolved into something far more sophisticated than its simple, humble origins. Marie's network now included several other young women who had learned her techniques, with each one producing dolls in different parts of Paris and even in other French cities beyond the capital. The maps themselves had grown considerably more detailed and comprehensive, incorporating intelligence about troop movements, supply depots, and defensive positions that resistance observers had carefully noted at great personal risk. The doll makers never met each other face to face for critical security reasons, communicating only through carefully vetted intermediaries. But Marie often thought about these other young women she'd never met, working away in their own hidden workshops scattered across the country, carefully folding silk and sealing seams with the same dedication she brought to the work, each one performing a small act of defiance against an occupation that had seemed completely invincible just a few short years before. One of Marie's most remarkable and complex creations came in April of 1944. An American intelligence officer who was operating undercover in Paris needed extremely detailed information about coastal defenses in Normandy. But he absolutely couldn't risk carrying any documents that might be discovered. Marie created a special doll that was larger than her usual designs, and this one contained not one, but 5 completely separate maps, with each one showing different sections of the coast with truly remarkable detail and accuracy. The maps included crucial information about beach obstacles that had been placed, artillery positions that had been established, and the precise locations of fortified structures, with all of this intelligence gathered by resistance members at tremendous personal risk to themselves. The officer, whose real name Marie never learned and never asked, examined the doll with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had been extensively trained to spot hidden compartments and deception. He spent nearly 15 full minutes going over every single inch of the construction before finally nodding in satisfaction at what he found, or rather what he couldn't find. "If I didn't know exactly what I was looking for," he said in English-accented French, his tone respectful, "I would never ever find it. This is truly extraordinary work you've done here." That particular doll made it successfully all the way to England, where the maps it contained contributed directly to the detailed planning for the June landings that would change the course of the entire war. Marie wouldn't learn about this connection until many years later, but she often wondered about that particular doll over the years, about where exactly it went and what specific things it helped accomplish in the broader war effort. The most dangerous and nerve-wracking period for the operation came in the weeks immediately following the Normandy landings in June. As Allied forces fought their way inland from the beaches, occupation authorities in Paris became increasingly nervous, unpredictable, and paranoid about potential threats. Checkpoints multiplied dramatically throughout the city. Searches became far more thorough and invasive, and the consequences of being caught with any kind of contraband became even more severe than they already were. Several members of the broader resistance network were detained during this particularly tense period, though fortunately none of them who knew about the doll operation specifically or could reveal its secrets. Marie experienced a moment of absolutely profound fear when German soldiers came directly to the workshop in early July, demanding to see exactly what they were producing there. Elise handled the extremely tense situation with remarkable composure and calm, showing them around the workspace and patiently explaining the entire doll-making process, step by step. One soldier picked up a doll that actually contained a hidden map inside and studied it very carefully and thoroughly. Marie continued working at her table, forcing her hands to remain steady and her expression to stay neutral despite the terror coursing through her. The soldier examined the stitching extremely closely, turning the doll over multiple times. "These are very well made," he finally said, his tone almost admiring. "My wife back home would really appreciate craftsmanship like this." After the soldiers finally left the workshop, Marie sat down suddenly and heavily, releasing all the terror she had kept carefully hidden during the entire inspection. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she realized she'd been holding her breath for much of the encounter. As summer progressed steadily, and Allied forces continued their advance toward Paris itself, the nature of their work shifted significantly once again. Instead of primarily helping individuals escape occupied territory as they had been doing, the maps now helped coordinate resistance activities within Paris itself in preparation for liberation. Marie created dolls containing maps that showed German defensive positions throughout the city, precise locations of ammunition depots, and specific routes that resistance fighters could use to move through Paris without encountering major checkpoints or patrols. The liberation of Paris in late August of 1944 felt both sudden and inevitable at the same time. Marie was working in the workshop when she heard the bells of Notre Dame beginning to ring, followed almost immediately by bells from churches all across the city, a sound that had been strictly forbidden during the entire occupation. People flooded into the streets in massive numbers, laughing and crying simultaneously, embracing complete strangers in their joy and relief. The German forces were withdrawing from the city, and French and Allied troops were entering Paris as liberators. Marie and Elise stood together at their attic window, watching the spontaneous celebrations unfolding below them in the streets. Marie held one of her dolls in her hands, this one genuinely just a toy with no hidden compartments or secrets inside. "Is it finally over?" she asked quietly, almost afraid to believe it. Elise put her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders and pulled her close. "This part is over," she said gently. "But what you've done, what we've done together here, that matters. It will matter for a very long time to come." In the weeks and months that followed, as Paris slowly recovered and rebuilt itself, the full scope and impact of the Mapdoll operation began to emerge and become clear. Allied intelligence officers interviewed Marie and her team extensively, carefully documenting all their methods and collecting examples of the dolls for analysis. They were absolutely astounded by the sophistication of the operation and the remarkable fact that it had never been fully discovered or shut down, despite operating continuously for nearly 2 full years. The statistics were carefully compiled and verified. Marie and her network had produced approximately 430 dolls containing maps or important documents. Of these, roughly 360 had been successfully delivered to their intended recipients without incident. The dolls had directly aided in helping more than 280 individuals reach safety in various locations, including Allied airmen, resistance fighters, and civilians fleeing persecution. Perhaps most remarkably, not a single person carrying one of Marie's dolls had been detained, specifically because of the map being discovered. The concealment had proven absolutely foolproof. British intelligence was particularly interested in the technical aspects of what Marie had accomplished. They examined the dolls microscopically under laboratory conditions, carefully studying Marie's stitching techniques and the ingenious way she had created hidden compartments that were nearly impossible to detect, even with specialized equipment. Some of her methods were subsequently incorporated directly into training programs for intelligence officers, teaching them entirely new ways to think about concealing sensitive materials in plain sight. But perhaps the most significant and emotional moment came in October of 1944, when Marie received a completely unexpected visitor at the workshop. James Richardson, the British pilot who had been her very first recipient way back in February 1943, had returned to Paris. He was in full uniform now, newly promoted in rank, and he carried a package wrapped carefully in brown paper. They met in a small cafe near the Seine, the same general area where Marie had delivered so many dolls during the dark days of occupation. Richardson looked dramatically different now, healthy and confident, no longer the frightened and exhausted young man who had been hiding in that pharmacy basement nearly 2 years earlier. He handed her the package without saying anything at first. Inside, carefully preserved, was the doll she had given him all that time ago. The blue dress was faded from its journey, and one of the yarn pigtails was coming loose, clear evidence of the hard journey it had endured. "I carried this all the way to Spain," Richardson said, his voice thick with emotion. "And then I carried it back to England with me, and now I've brought it back here to Paris because I wanted you to know, I needed you to know, that this little doll saved my life. Without it, I would have been completely lost out there. I would have probably been detained within the first 2 days of my journey." He paused, his voice becoming even thicker with emotion as he continued. "But more than that, every single time I was scared or exhausted or thought about giving up entirely, I would look at this doll and remember that someone in Paris, someone I had never even met, cared enough to help me survive. That thought kept me going when nothing else would." Marie held the worn doll carefully in her hands, fighting back tears that were threatening to overflow. It seemed completely impossible that this small object, which she had made in just a few hours one cold February afternoon, had traveled so far and meant so much to someone. She thought about all the other dolls she had made over the months, scattered now across Europe. Some probably lost or destroyed in the chaos of war, but others perhaps treasured by those who had carried them to freedom and safety. Richardson wasn't the only one to return to Paris, seeking Marie out. Over the following months, others came back to the city, actively seeking out the young woman who had given them hope disguised as a simple toy. An American navigator brought flowers as a gift of gratitude. A Belgian resistance fighter brought a heartfelt letter from his wife, thanking Marie for bringing her husband home safely. A Jewish woman brought her daughter, a baby who had been born in Switzerland after her mother had fled France with one of Marie's dolls, showing the route to safety clutched in her hands. The workshop on Rue de la Fontaine became something of an unofficial pilgrimage site for those whose lives had been touched by the operation in one way or another. Elise, though increasingly frail with age, welcomed them all graciously, making weak tea from their meager supplies and listening intently to stories of journeys and escapes, of fear and hope and survival against impossible odds. Marie herself struggled significantly with the aftermath of it all. She had spent her entire teenage years doing work that most adults would find absolutely terrifying and overwhelming. Now at 19 years old, she found herself uncertain and adrift about what came next in her life. But she seriously underestimated how powerfully her story would resonate with people. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre, a prestigious military decoration. Allied governments sent official commendations recognizing her contribution to the war effort. But the recognition that meant the absolute most to her came from the resistance networks themselves, the people who had worked alongside her and understood the risks she'd taken. In 1946, Marie was officially invited to London to speak with British intelligence about her work in detail. One senior officer told her something that really stuck with her over the years, that her methods had fundamentally revolutionized their thinking about concealment and intelligence operations. "We were so focused on sophisticated technical solutions," he explained to her earnestly. "Hidden cameras, invisible inks, complex codes and ciphers, all these high-tech approaches. And here you were, a teenager working in an attic, creating something that defeated all our best detection methods, using nothing but basic sewing skills and careful thought. You taught us something invaluable, that sometimes the simplest solutions are actually the most effective ones. Marie returned to Paris and, with some of the recognition money she had received from various sources, expanded the workshop significantly. She and Elise began teaching their techniques to young women who wanted to learn traditional crafts and skills. The workshop became well known for producing exceptional handmade dolls, though now they contained no secrets whatsoever beyond the skill and care that went into their creation. Elise passed away peacefully in 1949. Surrounded by dolls that she and Marie had made together over the years, Marie continued running the workshop alone for several years after that, but her heart honestly wasn't fully in it anymore. The dolls reminded her too much of those intense, frightening years when each one represented not just craftsmanship, but literally life and death for someone. In 1952, Marie made a decision that surprised many people who knew her well. She enrolled in university to study history formally. She wanted to understand the broader context of what she had lived through, to see her small part in the much larger story of the conflict and resistance movements. She excelled in her studies, eventually earning a doctorate degree and becoming a respected historian in her own right, specializing in civilian resistance movements during wartime periods. Throughout her entire academic career, Marie rarely spoke publicly about her own personal experiences during the war. She believed deeply that history was about much more than just individual stories, that it was about understanding larger systems and patterns and the ways ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. But she also dedicated herself to collecting stories from other resistance workers, particularly women whose contributions had been overlooked or minimized in official histories that focused on military actions. In the 1970s, as interest in the French resistance experienced a significant revival, Marie was finally persuaded to write a detailed memoir of her experiences. The book, which she titled Silk and Secrets, became an unexpected success, not just in France where you might expect it, but internationally across many countries. Readers were captivated by the story of the teenage girl who had created one of the most effective intelligence tools of the entire occupation period, using nothing but skill, courage, and creativity. Marie lived long enough to see her story adapted for both film and theater productions, though she consistently maintained that the dramatizations never quite captured the terrifying ordinariness of what she had actually done. It wasn't glamorous at all, she insisted in numerous interviews over the years. It was cold attic rooms, and constantly being afraid, and fingers that hurt from endless stitching by candlelight. But it was also knowing that what you did mattered, that you were helping people survive, and that feeling made everything else bearable. She kept in touch with many of those she had helped over the years, maintaining relationships that lasted decades. Richardson became a lifelong friend, visiting Paris regularly with his family. The Jewish woman whose escape she had aided named her daughter Marie in her honor. The resistance fighters she had worked with remained close, meeting annually to remember those who hadn't survived the war and celebrate those who had. One of the most touching and unexpected moments came in 1994 during the 50th anniversary celebrations of Paris's liberation. Marie, now 70 years old, was invited to participate in various commemorative events. At one formal ceremony, She was approached by a German man about her same age, who introduced himself as the son of the soldier who had bought a doll from her for his daughter back during the occupation. "My father kept that doll his entire life," the man said through tears, clearly emotional. After the conflict ended, he struggled deeply with what he had been part of, with the things he had witnessed and sometimes failed to prevent. But he always said that doll reminded him that even in the darkest times imaginable, there were people doing good things, creating beauty, and helping others. It gave him some measure of peace in his final years. He handed Marie a faded photograph, a little girl holding one of Marie's dolls, smiling shyly at the camera. "My sister," he explained, his voice breaking slightly. "She died young, but she absolutely loved that doll. My father wanted me to find you someday, to thank you for that small kindness in a time when kindness was incredibly rare." Marie held the photograph carefully, thinking about how complicated and layered history truly was, how individual lives and choices wove together in ways that couldn't be predicted or fully understood at the time. She had been so focused on helping the resistance that she had never considered that her dolls might also represent something important to those on the other side of the occupation, that a simple toy could carry meaning far beyond its intended purpose. In her final years, Marie established a foundation dedicated to preserving the history of civilian resistance during wartime. She donated her remaining dolls, including the precious one that Richardson had returned to her, to museums where they could be properly studied and remembered by future generations. She funded scholarships for young people studying history, particularly those interested in how ordinary individuals respond to extraordinary challenges and moral dilemmas. Marie Dubois passed away in 2007 at the age of 83. Her funeral was attended by hundreds and hundreds of people, including children and grandchildren of those she had helped during the occupation. Several elderly men and women brought dolls that they or their parents had carried to freedom more than 60 years earlier, placing them gently on her casket as a final tribute to her legacy. The workshop on Rue de la Fontaine still stands to this day, now marked with a commemorative plaque that reads, "Here, Marie Dubois and Elise Dubois created hope during the darkest days of occupation. Their dolls carried more than maps. They carried proof that courage takes many forms, and that the smallest acts, repeated with determination, can change the course of history." The story of Marie's dolls has been studied extensively by military historians and intelligence analysts around the world. Her techniques have been taught in various forms to intelligence operatives in multiple countries. But perhaps more importantly than the tactical lessons, her story has become emblematic of a larger truth about resistance and survival during wartime. That it wasn't just soldiers and spies who determined outcomes, but also teenagers working in attics, elderly women in workshops, and countless others whose names history never recorded or celebrated. In the archives of British intelligence, carefully preserved in climate-controlled facilities, are several of Marie's original dolls. Researchers occasionally examine them with great care, marveling at the craftsmanship and the ingenuity that went into their creation. But even more impressive than the technical skill on display is what these dolls represent on a deeper level: the determination of people to help each other in times of crisis, to resist oppression through whatever means available to them, and to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible to find. The silk maps themselves, when carefully unfolded under proper lighting conditions, reveal not just geographic details, but tiny markings that served multiple purposes. Some indicated safe houses where help could be found. Others marked dangerous areas to avoid at all costs. Still others contained coded information that only specific recipients could interpret correctly. Each map was unique and customized, tailored to its recipient's specific needs, and incorporating the latest intelligence available at the time. This customization was part of what made the operation so effective and so difficult for authorities to detect or stop. Claude Beaumont, the cartographer who created the original maps, survived the occupation and continued his work with geographic services after liberation. He never sought recognition or credit for his role in the operation, preferring to let Marie receive the credit he felt she more than deserved. When interviewed late in his life, he simply said with characteristic modesty, "I made the maps, but Marie made them matter. Anyone could draw lines on silk. She turned those lines into lifelines." Henri Masson, the textile printer who developed the inks and techniques for transferring maps to silk, used his wartime innovations to rebuild his printing business after liberation. He became quite successful, producing high-quality textile prints for commercial purposes. Though he never forgot that his most important work had been done in secret during those dark years, creating tiny maps that helped people find their way to freedom. The impact of the map doll operation extended far beyond the specific individuals it helped directly. Word of the technique spread through resistance networks across occupied Europe, inspiring similar operations in other countries facing occupation. Each adaptation was unique, suited to local conditions and available resources, but all shared the same basic insight that Marie had demonstrated so effectively. The best hiding places are often in plain sight, disguised as something so ordinary and commonplace that no one thinks to look twice. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments section below. What part of this historical account surprised you the most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.